The warm, dark sea breathed slowly against the harbour wall, lifting and settling with a sound like a sleeper turning in a dream. A single clay lamp burned low on the deck of a moored ship, its small flame leaning and straightening in a breath of sea air, casting a trembling pool of light on the black water beneath the hull. The great hill of the Citadel stood quiet and immense above the sleeping roofs, its crown of temples and colonnades pale against the sky. And above it, the stars were strewn thick and bright, the whole wide sweep of the summer night turning slow and silent over the African coast. There was no wind to trouble the sails, no tide to rush the harbour, only the slow, steady breathing of the southern sea as it kept watch over the resting city. The moon rode high now, laying a long, quiet path of silver across the black water, a road of light that stretched from the harbour mouth far out toward the unseen northern shore. It shone on the tiled roofs of the city and on the broad paved streets laid straight between their colonnades, on the shuttered shops and the closed doors and the dark windows, on the palm fronds stirring over hidden courtyards and the still fountains in their basins. The day's heat had long since softened into a mild dark, and the air was warm and dry and full of the sea, full of the smell of warm stone and dust and fig trees, and somewhere from a garden wall the sweet breath of rose and myrtle drifting in the night. A night bird called once out over the water, a low melodic trill, and the sound drifted lazily through the warm air before fading into the vast open quiet. The last carts had gone from the paved streets at dusk, their wooden wheels falling quiet on the warm stone. The mules led away to their stables in the lower town. One by one the shops had shuttered under the long colonnades. The potter's stall, with its red-glazed bowls, stacked neat in the dark. The cloth merchants, with its bolts of wool and linen laid away. The fruit sellers, where the last figs of the day had been sold, and the stone counter swept clean. The great forum on the Citadel hill stood empty now, its broad pavement silvered by starlight. The steps of the basilica pale and still, the bronze doors of the temples shut fast, the statues quiet on their pedestals with the moon on their marble shoulders. The day's voices, the merchants calling, the mules clopping, the water sellers crying their trade, the children running in the side streets, had all faded into the warm night, and the city had drawn its breath and settled into rest like a great animal folding itself down into sleep. Down by the water, the two harbours lay quiet under the stars. The outer merchant harbour stretched wide and rectangular, its stone quays crowded with ships moored side by side, their masts a dark forest, swaying almost imperceptibly against the sky. The great sea road that carried the corn and the oil and the fine red pottery of Africa out to Rome and the world ran through this harbour. And by day it was a clamour of loading and unloading, of cranes and ropes and shouted orders. But now the ships lay still at their ropes, their furled sails pale in the moonlight, their decks dark and empty. And a single anchor lamp swung softly from a stern post, creaking on its chain with the slow rock of the hull. Through a narrow channel, the inner harbour opened, the famous round harbour of the old sea people, a perfect circle of dark water ringed by stone ship sheds. Long ago, in another age, this ring had held the fleet of the old city. But that age was gone, and now the round harbour served the trade of Rome like its greater neighbour, its shipsheds standing dark, with their slips washed clean by the tide, and their doors shut for the night. At its centre lay a low island, and there, where the watch-house of the old harbour had once stood, a small round court of white columns and two little temples rose pale and silent in the moonlight. And the moon made a second ring upon the water, a trembling circle that shimmered with each slow pulse of the sea. Behind the harbours, the grain warehouses rose dark and enormous, their long aisles heaped with the wheat of the wide African fields, the year's harvest resting in the cool dark, waiting for the great corn ships that would carry it north to feed the city of Rome. The doors stood wide to let the night air move through the grain, and inside the darkness was full of the smell of dry wheat and dust and sacking, a deep, rich smell of earth and sun and summer stored up against the winter. Sacks lay stacked higher than a man's head, row on row, and the wheat inside them rustled faintly as it settled, a soft whisper in the dark, like the sound of the wind moving over the far-off fields. This was the sleeping plenty of a whole province gathered quietly by the sea. The bread on the tables of distant Rome, the morning loaves in 1,000 bakeries, the daily grain that kept a great city fed, all of it beginning here, in these dark aisles by the African water, under the slow turning of the same stars that shone on the fields where it grew. The citadel hill of the Byrsa rose over the heart of the city, and on its crown the Roman Forum stood pale and quiet in the starlight. The great basilica stretched its long roof against the sky, its rows of columns catching the moonlight on their pale stone. The capital temple stood high on its podium, its steps broad and silent, its great doors shut fast. Jupiter and Juno and Minerva keeping the city from their dark shrine within. Below the hill, the colonnaded streets ran straight as rulers down to the harbours, their porticos casting long shadows in the moon, their fountains running softly to themselves in the dark. Behind their high walls lay the fine houses of the merchants, their inner courtyards open to the stars, and in one such courtyard, a single hanging lamp burned low, its flame reflected in the still water of a small pool. Around it, the mosaic floor gleamed faintly, a hunting scene worked in tiny coloured stones, hounds and a stag caught forever in their silent chase, the tesserae cool and smooth under the touch of the night air. And in another house, the floor showed the seasons, spring with her flowers, and summer with her sheaf of grain, and autumn with his grapes, and winter with his cloak drawn close, all lying quiet in the dark. A palm frond stirred over the pool, its shadow moving slow across the coloured stones, and from somewhere a dove cooed once, soft and low, and fell silent. Along the shore, the great sea baths stood dark and still, their vast halls empty, their marble pavements cool and silent. The water in the great pools had gone quiet, no ripple disturbing its dark surface. The last steam from the hot rooms had long faded into the night. The coloured marbles of the walls glimmered in the starlight that fell through the high windows. In one of the great vaulted halls, a single lamp had been left burning by an attendant, and its small flame made a warm glow on the cold stone, a tiny point of light in the enormous dark, while the sea breathed just beyond the seaward wall, a soft, heavy rhythm, and the salt air moved gently through the open windows. And beyond the city, the great aqueduct strode on its arches across the dark plain, a long, silent line of stone carrying sweet water from the far blue mountains to the deep cisterns of Carthage. The water moved unseen inside its channel, a slow, steady current that had travelled for days from the mountain springs, and now in the dark it poured quietly into the vast underground cisterns, where it lay deep and still and cold, the lifeblood of the sea city gathered in the cool dark, the sound of it falling soft and distant and continuous, a whisper at the edge of hearing threaded quietly through the warm African night. All through the sleeping city, at street corners and in doorways, and in the small courtyards of the humbler houses, the little shrines of the Heavenly Lady were burning low. A carved niche in a wall, a small stone altar set against the house front, a simple shelf under a portico, each one held its clay lamp, and each lamp held its small flame, and each flame was a quiet word spoken into the dark. Here and there a little incense smouldered, a thin thread of sweet smoke rising straight into the still air. Here and there a few figs or a handful of grain, or a small cup of wine had been set out, the first fruits of the season left in thanks. And at one such shrine, in a narrow side street where the moonlight fell in a slant between the buildings, an old woman was trimming the wick of her doorway lamp with slow, careful fingers, her lips moving softly, murmuring the old words to the Queen of Heaven who kept her house and her children and her children's children, the near and beloved sky goddess who had watched over this city from the very beginning. Long before the Romans came, long before the paved streets and the great baths and the aqueduct from the mountains, the face of heaven, Tanit, whom the Romans now called Caelestis, the heavenly one. She was the oldest and dearest god of the place. The sky itself made a mother over the city. In the great temple on the hill, they honored her with incense and music and processions. But here in the small shrines, she was near and warm and homely. The Lady of the Moon that waxed and waned over the sea, of the stars strewn thick above the Citadel, of the rain that came in its season to the thirsty land, and the grain that rose green in the wide fields behind the town. They showed her crowned or veiled, sometimes with the moon at her brow, sometimes with an ear of ripe grain or a green palm branch in her hand, sometimes with a gentle lion lying at rest beside her. Not a beast of terror, but a calm and noble guardian, tamed by her quiet majesty. Her old sign was cut into stones all over the city, a plain, upright figure with arms raised beneath a disc and a crescent, simple as a drawing a child might make in the dust, and as old as the first ships that ever came to this coast. She was the Queen of Heaven, the guardian of the city, the keeper of the moon and the stars and the turning year. And the people of Carthage had loved her from the very beginning. She kept the sky over the city, and the rain that fell on the fields, and the grain that rose from the dark ground. It was her gentle power that called the clouds from the sea, and sent the soft, soaking rains to sink into the dry fields, waking the sleeping seed and calling the green grain up from the red soil. She was the goddess of all that grew and ripened, of the swelling grape on the vine, and the heavy bending of the olive branch in the autumn sun. She watched over the woman in childbed and eased her labor, and kept the newborn warm and safe in its cradle through the long, dark hours. Her protection rested over the full storeroom and the abundant harvest, so that no household in the city need fear the lean months. And she watched over the ships that went out on the dark sea and came safely home. A merchant setting sail for Ostia with a hold full of African wheat would murmur a word to her before the lines were cast off. A farmer, watching the first green shoots push through the red earth, would nod his thanks to her under his breath. A mother, when the child lay at last, safe and warm in its wrappings, would bring a little lamp and a handful of grain to the shrine at the corner and set them down with trembling hands. She was the near and motherly power that kept the whole warm circle of a life. The birth and the growing and the harvest, and the going out and the coming home, while she also kept the wheeling sky above it, the moon that measured the months, and the stars that marked the seasons, and the rain that came and went in its own slow time. There was an old story the grandmothers of Carthage still told, half memory and half legend, of how the city had begun under her keeping. Long, long ago, they say, a queen had come over the sea from a far eastern shore, out of a city of purple and cedar, leading her people across the dark water to this African coast to begin again. She was wise and clever, and the heavenly lady watched over her ship. And when she came to this shore, she asked the people of the land only for as much ground as a single ox hide would cover. And when they granted it, she took the ox hide and cut it into one long, fine thread, and drew that thread out and out around the whole crest of the hill, and so won the citadel where the city began, the hill they still called the Byrsa, the ox hide, to this very night. And there she built the city by the sea, and laid its first stones under the sky, and dedicated it to the Queen of Heaven, who had brought her safely over the water. The old woman trimming her lamp remembered her own grandmother telling her that story on a warm night like this one, with the moon on the water and the sea breathing slow against the shore. And the story had seemed to her then as true and as near as the lamp flame and the stars. The wise queen who came over the sea, the clever winning of the hill, the city founded under heaven, and the heavenly lady watching over it all from the very first hour. All through the city, the little shrines were warm with small offerings, each one a kept promise, each one a household's thanks, laid quietly before the Queen of Heaven. A mother whose child had burned with fever and then cooled and slept and wakened well had brought a little clay lamp and a cup of wine. A farmer whose fields had greened after a dry spring had brought the first ears of grain, still tender and pale, and laid them at the feet of the small stone image in his village shrine. A merchant whose ship had come safe through a late-season gale had brought incense and a carved stone of thanks, a simple figure of a ship under sail with the crescent moon above it. The vows were made in hope or in fear: a safe birth, rain for the dry fields, a good harvest, a ship home over the sea, a fever past. And when the good thing came, the thanks were paid gladly, a little grain and a little wine, and a few figs set out, a lamp lit, a soft word murmured in the dark. Each offering was a small thing, a handful of wheat, a clay lamp, a cup of cheap wine. But together they made a great quiet warmth that rose from the whole city like the breath of a single sleeping body, a long, soft exhalation of thanks that the heavenly lady received as a mother receives the small gifts her children bring her, a flower, a smooth stone, a kiss, and treasures them all alike. And at the heart of it all lay the deep, gentle thing the old grandmothers knew and told their children's children, that the heavenly lady turned the whole slow round of things softly, like the moon she wore upon her brow. The moon that thinned to nothing and filled again, the rain that fell and sank into the red earth and rose as green corn, the grain that ripened gold and was cut down and then sown again into the dark ground to sleep and wake. Nothing she kept was ever truly lost, only turned and returned. The seed that fell into the furrow did not die. It slept in the dark and rose again, 100 grains from the one. The moon that shrank to a sliver in the western sky always came back to fullness, rising over the sea like a new lit lamp. And this gave to a mind lying down in the dark the same soft hope the turning moon gave, that the dark was only half of a circle, that the seed slept in the ground and would rise, that rest was not an ending, and that everyone who lay down safe tonight lay down under the quiet keeping of the sky. The same grain the heavenly lady ripened in the fields was the corn heaped in the dark warehouses, and the bread on every table in the city and in far-off Rome. The same sea that carried the founding queen to this shore still slid against the quays in the dark and carried the ships out and home. The same moon that was the goddess's own crown laid its long path across the black water and shone on the sleeping roofs. And the newborn, asleep in its cradle, rhymed with the seed asleep in the ground, and with every sleeper who lay down in the dark of this night and would wake in the morning. The thought of that quiet keeping flowed softly back down over the sleeping streets. The shrine lamps were burning low now before the Queen of Heaven, the incense gone to a thread of sweet smoke that rose and vanished in the warm air. The first fruits set out in their little bowls, glimmering faintly in the flame light. And the old woman had finished trimming her lamp and sat a long moment on her doorstep, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the small steady flame, before she rose and went inside, and the street was quiet again. Down at the Harbours, a guard sat by a small brazier at the quiet quay, the coals glowing red and low, his cloak drawn about his shoulders, not watching for anything, for there was nothing to fear, only the dark water and the sleeping ships. But there, all the same, a small, quiet point of wakefulness in the great sleeping city. A night watchman walked the long colonnaded street with his lamp swinging in his hand, his hobnailed shoes quiet on the warm paving. A baker banked his oven for the morning bread, raking the hot ashes into a pile at the back of the brick chamber, and the smell of wood smoke drifted out into the street and rose toward the stars. A temple servant trimmed a lamp before a dark altar on the hill, his bare feet silent on the cool marble. And a mother sat up a while by a cradle in a warm room open to the courtyard, listening to the soft breathing of her child, one hand resting lightly on the wooden rim. Beyond the city, the wide fields and olive groves stretched away into the dark, the grain sleeping in the ground as seed in the warm red earth, the olive trees silvered and still under the moon. Here and there, along the country roads, a small shrine stood at a crossroads, its lamp burning low, its offering of grain or figs laid out, and the Heavenly Lady kept watch over the sleeping fields as she kept watch over the sleeping city. A sailor lay asleep on the deck of a moored ship, his head pillowed on a coil of rope, the stars turning above him and the sea rocking the hull with a slow, gentle motion, like a mother rocking a cradle. A cat settled on a flat, sun-warmed roof and curled into itself and closed its eyes. And far off across the warm streets, a dog answered another. Two quiet voices trading a call in the dark, and then they too fell silent. The wide sea slid on forever against the quays, breathing its slow, deep breath. The same sea that had carried the founding queen to this coast. The same sea that would carry the grain ships north when the morning came. The same dark water that lay beneath the moon's long path and stretched away toward unseen shores, where other cities lay sleeping under the same stars. The moon rode quiet now over the water, its path a broad shimmer on the black swell, and the warm sea dark deepened around the sleeping city. The Citadel hill kept its silent watch over the roofs and the harbours and the grain stores and the fine houses and the little shrines. The sea lapped soft at the quays, and the shrine lamps guttered low before the Queen of Heaven, their small flames sinking toward the oil. The Heavenly Lady kept the moon and the grain and the newborn alike, holding the whole wide circle of life in her quiet, motherly hands. And the sleepers lay safe in the dark, as the seed lies safe in the ground, as the ship rests quiet in the harbour, as the moon rides slow over the water, and the great wheel of the stars turns above the wide sea, and the sleeping coast sinking softly, slowly, toward a deep and unbroken silence.